shooting occurred last night. Copy, so you have not found additional evidence in reference to 5120 Mass Southeast, correct? Affirm, ready, yes, I did, Commander.
Then 4 armed suspects caught on tape trying to break into a Southwest Side home.
The woman, the victim, tells us that a man broke into her house and tried to rape her.
Terrifying moments for a woman who woke up to a strange man in bed with her. The woman screamed. Her brother rushed in to help and tried to fight to defend her off. People living in the neighborhood heard all the gunshots.
With news and media opinion practically everywhere, its influence is felt throughout all areas of America. News coverage can shape the public's perception of populations, organizations, and neighborhoods. Media ensures that the public is exposed to a precise amount of information on topics that they choose to report, much like the American political system. Just as media can be advantageous to members of a community depending on how that area is portrayed, it can just as easily have detrimental effects on the reputation and corresponding behavior of less wealthy populations. If the media presents the poor as scrounging, idle, benefit-cheating criminals, people who are not poor might believe that's the case. If they present the poor as similar to everyone else but trapped in a flawed system with a desire to move on, then people might believe that instead. Public opinion is an important aspect of how people treat those living in poverty and how the government responds to issues concerning poverty. If middle to high income individuals, that represent 4/5 of the U.S. population, have a stereotyped and generally negative view of the impoverished fifth, they will treat them accordingly, in job interviews, shops, restaurants, and on the street. This only ensures that the poor stay poor and the rich stay wealthy. If the government concludes that tightening laws on welfare and benefit cheats would be more popular than a raise in benefit levels amongst a majority of Americans not receiving benefits, but voting, they are likely to choose the former. Again, this ensures that the poor remain in poverty and that others stay out. Story selection and the power it has on perception plays an important role in the way in which communities are framed. During 2012, an average of 112.4 instances of crime and violence were publicized monthly by newspapers and television covering Southeast Anacostia, a high-crime, low-income area in D.C. For crimes covering Congress Heights, a gentrified middle to high-income area of D.C. with roughly the same population density, the average was roughly 82.3 instances of crime. In none of the Anacostia cases were there examinations of the crimes, merely reports that they had happened. Cases in Congress Heights were extensively examined, suggesting that the welfare of high-income communities is priority, and that the poor seem to qualify only as second-class citizens. By selectively exposing the public to a portion of problems as a result of living in poverty, media minimizes the underlying issues that begin the cycle in areas like Anacostia.
If a particular organization chooses certain stories about one neighborhood that are negative, the attitude about that neighborhood will be more negative. And in fact, there may be negative stories happening there. But if we tell that story all of the time, it's not necessarily fair to a particular area, and vice versa.
They report more about, poverty area, bad news about the poverty, and more good news about the rich people. I mean, I guess it's new, whatever say.
As the poor are continuously silenced and not spoken for, action to resolve real issues connected to poverty are consequentially delayed, and the primary objective of government incentives remains to appeal to the majority of working middle-class Americans.
Written for the Washington Post and pretty much every newspaper and publication in the Washington, D.C. area. Things have a perpetual cycle. I think that there's a media government poverty complex where they work as a dynamo to perpetuate poverty so that they have an underclass that they can manipulate. I think it goes a long way.
While it is true that poor communities are also statistically the highest in crime and violence, media coverage often only reflects a small fraction of the problems that exist in these areas. Stories covering the poor may occasionally shift when news is not intently focused on violence and criminal acts. They may periodically cover the outliers of the poor population who manage to move out of the projects and become active citizens who contribute to the wealth of the nation.
I mean, not just even with economic issues, but all types of issues. I think they're always, like people with disabilities or people, they never really focus on the struggle. They always focus on like, well, look at what this one person accomplished. And I always feel like they put the blame off on everyone else. They're like, oh, well, you're just not trying hard enough. Instead of actually focusing with what they're really dealing with.
While rags to riches stories are uplifting examples of realizing the American dream, they hardly do anything to encourage citizen or government action. They frame the very people who have risen from poverty as having done so by hard work alone, and that all underprivileged people, no matter what their disadvantage, can realize the same opportunities should they work towards the same ideal. This only ensures that nothing of great value will be done for the poor, because the public is inclined to believe that anyone can rise from poverty to prosperity with a little hard work. When media coverage conveys too much crime and violence associated with the poor, it negatively impacts public opinion of impoverished areas and reduces people living in poor conditions to nothing more than criminals. However, when the media reports instances of people rising from poverty, it risks over-magnifying positive effects and oversimplifying issues surrounding poverty in the struggle to get out. Misrepresenting the poor only leads to a silent population bound by a ruthless cycle, and with a problem as complex as poverty, there is no one-size-fits-all solution.